Thank you, Shane, and thanks for inviting me. And thanks to Brenda and Julie and Lori and sort of the GCSE in general. My time today has already been a lot of fun. It's really great to be here and to see all of you. How many? Could you raise your hand if you're graduate students? Okay. That's wonderful, and you're in a nice place. Being able to you already know this, of course, and that's why you're here. But this kind of mixing that you're able to do as a result of the GCSE and what it does is a special thing. And I think I hope that some of what I say today backs that up. So I'm here to give you what I call an evolutionary approach to sustainability science. And but my real hope is that most of what I do today is largely redundant with what you already do and what you already know. And I think that if it is, I think that that's successful, but I want to make new connections between the things you already know. And that's how I know it will be useful. So first, I guess I'd like to start at sort of the place where almost everyone starts, the thing you teach undergraduates in the sustainability class, the thing that I teach my undergraduates, of course, is we have the tragedy of the commons. This wonderful paper. And I think what's so nice about Hardin's concept of the tragedy of the commons is not so much that it's commons per se, but that it's a cooperation problem, that he described, I think, very clearly that environmental degradation is often a social dilemma, is often a cooperation problem. And be it a commons or not, the regulatory structure or the social structure can vary. But cooperation problems are important. However, of course, he said his famous line in this paper is, solution is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, and so that's institutions, right? So the solution is institutions, and of course we have other people who have said that very clearly and with a lot of wonderful evidence to back it up, Elinor Ostrom being at the top of that list. And her work on common pool resources and contains this fantastic list of sort of key design elements that have emerged from studying small-scale common pool resource communities, and these are factors that tend to make those communities more successful in managing those resources sustainably. So that's great. So if we know the solution, then aren't we done? And just to broaden this, there have been people who say that these don't just apply to small-scale common pool resource institutions, but these apply to social ecological systems in general. And so aren't we done then? What I'd like to propose is that perhaps knowing the answer, knowing the end point, isn't enough to be done. And we need to know how to get there. And so how do we get to the solution? And what I'd like to propose is that Lynn Ostrom also suggested, in fact, you'll see this in her work a lot, something special about the way that we can get there, and that is that. And so I want to explain what I mean by this. Why an evolutionary approach? And we'll get to what is an evolutionary approach as well. Why an evolutionary approach to sustainability science? The first thing that I'm going to say, and I hope that this is at least a little bit controversial, although maybe it won't be. If it won't be, then you're getting a really good education. If it is, then you're in the right place still. And that is that there is no theory of sustainability. So, in the last, a decade or two, we've seen the emergence of sustainability science, which is wonderful and much overdue. It's been something that's been building for many decades, of course. But I would argue, and I'm a sustainability scientist, that it's not a science yet. And it's not a science in my mind because we do not do yet the full cycle of science. That is to say, we don't make predictions for new systems, test those predictions in new conditions, and then bring those back and change the body of theory that allows us to make those predictions in the first place. We haven't achieved that yet, which is not a problem. but it is something that we need to do. And doing it will allow us to achieve sustainable systems better. So, what are we missing? The way that I like to ask the question is, what does a theory of sustainability need? What would it do? What question would it ask? In my mind, the question it would ask is, how does sustainability happen? And there are a lot of different ways of sort of expanding on that. And what I like to say is, how do sustainable institutions and behaviors and societies, how do they emerge? And under what conditions do they persist? And when you think about it that way, it's sort of, well, of course, actually, you're right. We don't have that theory yet, which is kind of shocking. But I think that there's something that evolutionary tools can add to this. And I hope to sort of explain some of that to you today. Evolutionary tools are a natural fit for this kind of question because they are good at looking at questions of emergence and persistence of particular traits or systems. In addition, it offers sort of three sort of simple benefits. The first is that an evolutionary approach within the social sciences, and an evolutionary approach is non-disciplinary in the social sciences. Even in the biological sciences, it is sort of kind of generalized, and it's integrative in that sense. The second one is that people, and we saw this with Lynn Ostrom already, use evolutionary thinking implicitly, or maybe not evolutionary thinking, but evolutionary terminology and concepts implicitly. We'll see how the situation evolves, right? People talk a lot in social ecological systems literature about adaptive capacity. What is the adaptive capacity, right, of a given system? Climate change adaptation and mitigation. And what I'd like to propose is that if we can do a better job defining what we mean by adaptation in these cases, defining the mechanisms that make that adaptation precisely possible, then we can do a better job of understanding those phenomena and increasing them in the ways that are useful. And then I also will argue that there is some applied value that stands to be put to use here. So I sort of plan to take you through this approach and highlight some of the major outcomes as we go. But just before we do, to finish sort of characterizing where I think an evolutionary sort of social science fits, I think it's nice to talk a little bit about disciplinary silos, and I've been doing that with a handful of folks already today, graduate students and faculty alike. Nobody likes sort of random walls, and of course that is something that happens with social sciences in general and science, in academia, is that we have epistemologies and methodologies that accumulate in our disciplines, and that stops us from being able to communicate with each other. And of course that's a problem. But it is nothing short of shocking and disgraceful that in 2016 we take undergraduates and we separate them into different cohorts and we teach them different things about human behavior. And then if you take those undergraduates and you bring them back into the room at the end of their college experience and you ask them to what the fundamental components of human behavior are, they will disagree. You ask them what the fundamental components of the single most studied species in the history of the known universe is, they disagree, right? It's one species, right? And yet we have all of these different social sciences studying different parts of it. And all of that research is good. It's just, it's not the whole picture. And so I like to sort of think, and of course this is easy for me to say, being an evolutionary social scientist, that evolution's in the middle. But there are different ways of characterizing what the middle is. But I like to say, and I didn't even put all of the traditional social sciences up there, but that there's a middle place where we can take the evolutionary history that has influenced humans as a species that has evolved behavior and cognition seriously, like we do with other species, that also allows us to pay attention to the way our societies and cultures change and evolve, and also takes those and then uses them to understand population dynamics. And so I think that is something that, that lies ahead of us, and that, that we can explore and with particular benefit to understanding sustainability. So okay, that says 44 minutes because I started this presentation a long time ago. I'm going to have to use a different timer. There we go, 14 minutes. That was terrifying. 44 minutes, and I'm on slide 6? God, these people must be falling asleep. So here are, from the paper, which I'll give you a link to at the end, three, I think, very simple components of human behavior that I just want to include in a model of human behavior that I will be touching on. This is not some list. This is not some end-all, be-all list. But these are components of human behavior that are important and that I hope to weave into the story I'm about to tell you. So what is an evolutionary approach then? Well, the way that I like to sort of say this is that there are sort of three really important components to understanding how evolution can help us think about sustainability challenges. The first is that human culture evolves. The second is that cooperation, which is so often entailed in the challenges that we face, also itself evolves, and that groups matter. And they matter in both of those two things, and in very important and particular ways. And before I go any further, I'd like to say that I consider myself someone who delves into the evolutionary literature in the social sciences and in biology to a certain extent, and game theory, and then tries to export those to the world of environmental social science, sustainability science, and what have you. This is a package of those ideas and insights for you. So it's a long history of scholarship on the idea that human culture is a thing which evolves on its own in a different way than genetic systems, and yet interacts with genetic systems. We have Alan Rogers here in the audience, and he's one of the pioneers of this thinking and some of the mathematical models that have been very important in that study. However, when you say to most social scientists today, if you say, well, culture evolves, what they'll say is, well, yes, that's a nice metaphor, but it's a metaphor, and let's not take that too far because there are problems with that. But what I will tell you today, and hope to sort of show you, is that it's not just a metaphor, but that the process of cultural change does include an actual process of evolution, which is to say a process of equivalent to a natural selection type process. And that's not really a revolution to anyone. This is sort of actually quite common sense. But it's important to know because the dynamics can then be studied with a bunch of tools that have been built for the purpose and give us some extra leverage. So Darwin had sort of three basic principles for understanding what evolution is consisted of. And the first one is that it is variation. So humans have cultural traits, okay? So these can be norms, behavior, language, beliefs, traditions, etc., right? Style of dress, and they vary, right, between people for all sorts of reasons. Secondly, of course, those cultural traits can also be selected upon. So what does that mean? That means that they have different outcomes, and those outcomes matter, right? So some of these robots these individuals have built will do better than some of the other ones, right? Selection is when some of the cultural traits fare better, right? Is it better to have an umbrella or not in this situation? And finally, also that those traits can be transmitted between individuals. In the genetic sense, when we think about genetic evolution, that's genetic transmission, right? Inheritance. In the cultural sense, we call it transmission. And it happens in lots of ways, through social learning and imitation. Here we have someone who is, it's a very posed photo, but this person is perhaps her mother, and you can see that, and if she is her mother, then of course she's inherited her biological information, right, her genes, but in addition here, something else is going on. She's now inheriting, she's now strategically copying the behaviors of her mother, which is it's a whole different sort of layer of transmission that's happening on top, okay? So then we have these three components, and so what Darwin said is the components of, if you have variation that is selected upon and then transmitted, those are the requirements for adaptation, okay? And so we can say that cultural evolution, cultural evolution is Darwinian, okay? And this is something that has been argued about for a long time, and there's a wonderful, rich literature to read about. And I'm going to now breeze through some of the differences. The point, however, is that the study of the evolution of culture is that culture evolves in a very different way, of course, than genetic systems. And the variation in genetic systems tends to be random, whereas variation in cultural evolution tends often very much to be guided. You don't just randomly make a change in your behavior and start not using one finger for something, right? You make changes that make sense. Selection, it tends to be strategic. And transmission, of course, as I've already mentioned here a little bit, is also not just directly parent to child, right? But you can learn from anyone. You can imitate anyone. In fact, you do. You imitate your peers, right? So your cultural parents, some of your cultural parents are in this room, right? Your cultural parents can be younger than you. Some of mine certainly are. And so you can inherit cultural information from all over. There are also a large number of different types, apologies for this slide, processes of sort of cultural microevolution, if you will. One of them that is super unique is here, conformity, another frequency-dependent biases. A traditional way is, I might say, I might imitate people who look successful. I can imitate an individual. But with conformity with culture, because it's not a physical transfer of information between individuals, I can look at the entire room and I can simply do the thing that is done most commonly. That's not possible at all in a biological system. So there are a lot of ways in which it's very different. And one of the most important ones is here, of course, in biological phylogenies and inheritance. Species stay separate. After they gain reproductive isolation, then they diverge for the rest of their history. There are some special and important sort of caveats to that, but really that's the way it mostly is. Whereas with culture, because we can imitate and because we can infer the goals and intents of the people who we are imitating, there are no hard and fast species boundaries. You can take individuals from one side of the world and put them in another part of the world, and they can learn from that. In fact, it makes perfect sense to think that if we ever meet aliens, we'll be able to do the same thing with them. We'll be able to imitate them, and they'll be able to imitate us for the same reason. So culture, as an evolutionary mechanism, is why we're so successful. So this is a terrible picture, but it's a great paper where they compare the speed of cultural evolution with that of genetic evolution on equal footing. And cultural evolution, cultural change, measured in this way in Darwin's, which is a very awkward unit, but is faster, which is, of course, no surprise, right? Because that's why we're here doing what we're doing, right? And so if you look at the last 50,000 years of human history. We've spread across the globe to all of the habitable environments on Earth. And as we have done that, we've adapted to those environments. And how have we adapted? Have we adapted biologically to those environments? Yeah, a little bit. But mostly, right, we've adapted culturally to these environments. We've developed, rich tradition systems and technology and toolkits and skill sets, right, and traditional ecological knowledge that allows us to make use of the resources and the affordances of that environment, right. And importantly, an individual, so looking at all of this here, this is not something that an individual could create. If you put an individual in this environment, the individual over the course of its entire lifetime could not create kayaks and all of these complex tools and all of this sophisticated sewing and eyeglasses. It was just the whole bit. So instead, individuals inherit a large amount of adaptive cultural information about their environment, about how to survive in that environment from the population they live in. And so we have cultural inheritance, just in the same way, in a very similar way that we have genetic inheritance. And of course, we see the similar thing happening in very different parts of the world. Everything that I just said here is true, except it's totally different, right? Different language, different environment, different skills, different technology, different institutions, all of them adapted to their environment. So culture is the dominant mode of human adaptation to the environment in the last 10, 50,000 years, and of course, presently. And so if it is, then what does that mean for sustainability, right? Of course, it means a lot of things. The first thing I think it means is that if this is an evolutionary process, this process of evolving societies, that it means that there's no suggestion, there's no promise that what we are doing is sustainable, right? Species go extinct all the time, even without a major extinction. There's a background rate of extinction, and so that happens, right? We could become dependent on a fuel source, which is an ecological trap, and we have. So then what is left for us is to figure out what differentiates the cases that succeed from the cases that fail, and why. And how do we avoid Easter Island, right? How do we avoid that? So how do sustainable societies arise, and under what conditions do they persist? So that's where I plan to take us a little bit. And so that is the evolution of culture. Now we're going to talk about the evolution of cooperation. And then I hope to get to a couple of examples and move ahead. So cooperation is a wonderful construct in game theory, and one of the sort of most basic and really useful tools in social science is the prisoner's dilemma. Raise your hand as a graduate students if you've been exposed to the prisoner's dilemma in class. Okay, good. Okay, so a handful. Okay, raise your hand if you have not been exposed to it in class, so I have a sense. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so the prisoner's dilemma is very simple. You have two players here, player A and player B, and they both have two options. They can either cooperate or defect. And the first number is the payoff to player A, and the second number is the payoff to player B. So so what we have here is a very simple situation where two people make two decisions, and the outcomes depend on how those decisions interact. Importantly, the key component of the prisoner's dilemma, I'd recommend you read up on it, it's very fun, is that what's best for the individual is the exact opposite of what's best for the group. Okay, so it's best for the individual to defect and get a payoff of 3, while the other individual is cooperating and gets nothing. Okay, whereas what's best for the group, the sum, is the sum of the two. They both cooperate. Of course, what happens is if you're both cooperating, then I'm going to say, well, I defect, and if I defect, then we're over here. And if you know that I'm defecting, then there's no way that you want a 0, so you're going to defect, and we're both going to end up down here. And that means we're all in the tragedy of the commons. Okay, that's what the tragedy of the commons is. It's a social dilemma, like the prisoner's dilemma. There are other types of strategic interactions that we can think about that are very relevant as well. This is a coordination game, and in a coordination game such as the Stag Hunt here, they have these great names in game theory. In the Stag Hunt, what's best for the individual is also what's best for the group. So coordinating is something that everyone wants to do, and all we have to do is figure out how to do it and then get it done, and then everyone does better and the group does better. So these two things, these are two fundamental types of social situation that, of course, you've experienced hundreds of times in your lives. They exist all over the place, and they're very useful to think about. And of course, it's much, much harder to solve prisoner's dilemmas, to solve social dilemmas, than it is to solve coordination problems. However, we solve both. Humans solve both because we come across them all the time. And after we solve a hard prisoner's dilemma, one of the things we do is we often turn it into a coordination problem, and then we can wrap it up nicely and be done with it. How do we do that, though? How do we solve coordination? How do we solve cooperation problems? There are a number of sort of well-known mechanisms. In particular, if kin selection is one of them. I'm not going to bother to explain this. Reciprocity, though, is a way to do this. When we can reciprocate, then it's easy to cooperate. Whether we're doing it individually or whether we're doing it sort of across the whole group. Reciprocity can solve cooperation problems. And so can what's called group selection here. That is to say, when groups compete. So I'm going to explain that in more detail. The fundamental outcome, though, of all of this work is that the key thing you need to have cooperation succeed and persist is continued affiliation between those who are cooperating. If you have a bunch of people who are cooperating, but they're surrounded by a sea of people who are non-cooperators, they will eventually spend all their resources cooperating with the other ones and expire or what have you, right? So the key is making sure that cooperators get back part of what they have given in. So now here's how this works. So let's have a population of individuals, some of whom are cooperating. Leads to more selfish individuals, right? This should be pretty obvious. However, what's important, of course, is what reproduces. A successful group is what spreads. Then selection between groups. What does that select for? Well, it selects for successful groups filled with cooperative individuals. So when groups compete, individuals within groups, individuals in the successful groups, are cooperative. Right? Of course, this is no surprise because we live in a country where sports is very common, and we're very used to individuals being individualistic at the cost to the group. We live with this every day. But group selection of this sort has happened on both our genetic inheritance and our cultural inheritance. And so human genetics are likely to have been dramatically influenced by events like this. And this has led to a number of things. One, of course, is it's led to us wanting to avoid war, although we don't do that all the time, of course, because we're good at it, because we're selected to be good at it. We're selected to beat the other team, right? So how do we do that? We cooperate with each other. And so in general, a whole package of human behaviors termed prosociality is a way to think about how individuals support a larger social system that they're a part of. So it's reasonable to think, therefore, that we have a bunch of biologically inherited psychological mechanisms or adaptations that support this group functional behavior. And this allows us to do things like solve these collective action problems and solve these cooperation problems when we come across them. Of course, there are problems of different difficulties, however, and we can't solve them all. So, what are some of these things? If you talk to folks who have studied this more than I have, they will say things like human prosociality includes our sort of docility. We have specialized means of communication, which is to say language. We are cooperative breeders. We are conformist. We have sort of reputation that we care about. We display social markers. We display social identity. And so for the remainder of this talk, I want to take this background that sort of humans are evolved for group life as a given and move on, because I'm not here to talk about genetic evolution. I'm here to talk about cultural evolution. And so let's finish this off then, because in reality, we don't just have individuals competing or groups competing. In reality, we have both individuals and groups competing at the same time. So the question is then, how does that work? What we call that, and just in terms of framework, is multi-level selection. So we have individual selection, competition between individuals, group selection, competition between groups, and multi-level selection when both is happening at the same time. When both happen at the same time, the outcome depends on the balance of both effects. So is selection at the level of the group stronger, or is selection at the level of the individual stronger? That will determine how many cooperative individuals we have or how many selfish individuals we have. Okay. And this is all in a social dilemma. Okay. So now pop quiz. For those of you who've been paying attention, will this same dynamic happen? Do the levels of individual and group selection conflict in a coordination game? Remember, a coordination game is different. No. In a coordination game, what's best for the individual is also best for the group. And so the selection will favor the same thing here, will favor coordination here, and favor coordination here, and so therefore favor it in general, right? And so social dilemmas are particularly defined by this level of selection conflict, okay? And I propose to you that many of the hardest sustainability challenges that we face are defined by that level of selection conflict, by that social dilemma. Okay, so there are some very neat ways to think about this, though, and one of them is that we have these group functional traits, and these could be cooperative traits, for instance. And we can think about, and people have, and in fact, Alan Rogers has, thought about what are the conditions under which group functional traits emerge, or cooperative traits emerge. And here is one a very nice formulation, which Alan developed in 1990, I believe. And we have sort of three conditions here. And for those of you who are in biology or population genetics or conservation biology will recognize FST, and I won't bother to explain it. But the idea here is that when group benefit, the benefit of the behavior to the group is higher, or the cost to the individual is lower, or the difference between groups in terms of this trait is higher, it's more likely to evolve, okay? The cooperative trait is more likely to evolve. This is kind of common sense when you think about it, but it's very important and it can be used. Okay. And at the level of culture, we have a number of ways in which this happens, okay? So groups do come and go, right? and they come and go at lots of different ways and in lots of different sorts of human social organization. Sometimes, and so the selection of cultural group selection can happen when groups, go extinct at different rates, dependent on how well they coordinate with each other or cooperate, or how successful they are can actually matter, right? Because the successful ones might proliferate more. When groups themselves imitate other groups differentially, right? So if IBM has the awesome business model and everyone imitates IBM, then everyone becomes like IBM, and whatever that business model was, or whatever those traits are, spread. Similarly here, we can look at differential migration of individuals between groups, because they can bring with them those traits, or they can also adopt those traits when they arrive. So again, none of this is really surprising, right? We see it every day. Cooperative sports. Teams that are cooperative beat teams that are poorly organized. Teams that have a bunch of divas fail in comparison to a team that has a well-organized offense and defense, right? And that share the ball, right? Teams that have well-organized strategies also win. So this is a way, so the selection of cultural group selection is a way for us to understand the emergence of institutions, okay? And features that enhance it include things that tend to make differences between groups stronger. And I'm going to keep going because I don't want to waste too much time here. So what are the implications of this? Just sort of summarize this section. Humans sport biological adaptations that make us very effective in groups. Dramatically effective, so effective that we've taken over the planet. Okay. This includes cooperating. And that's important for sustainability. Second, the levels of selection conflict, a social dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, gives us a tool. Because we've known about social dilemmas for a long time. We've known about sort of selection for a long time, but we can use the idea that the level of selection matters. And if we can understand what the level of selection is, then we can use that as a tool when we are trying to understand social dilemmas that are problems in sustainability. And of course, as we've seen with warfare, with sports, with capitalist competition, with all sorts of things, with competition between departments in a university, et cetera, group competition tends to accelerate cooperation of individuals within the group. Again, everybody knows this at a basic level. And therefore, the competition can enhance institutional evolution. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just try to apply that little tool that I gave you to two examples. And then I'll sort of give you a little bit of a summary of some current work that's going on, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. I call this thing Cultural Multi-Level Selection Framework for Sustainability Analysis. Just a lot of words. This is just one way of doing it, and there are a lot of wonderful things that we can learn from the evolutionary study of human behavior that we can use in sustainability. This is just one packaging of a few of them. So as an example, though, this is an example of a village that I studied in South India, in Tamil Nadu, called Manavanur. And they have two really important natural resource systems that they use. The first one is this beautiful terraced irrigation system that goes all over the place and requires an unbelievably complex irrigation network made out of mud and dirt surrounding the village. And that takes a whole lot of coordination, and it also takes a good amount of cooperation. Second, of course, you see these little piles of sticks near their houses. These are winter fuel wood, and that's collected from a forest nearby. So that forest is actually shared by a number of villages, whereas the stream for the water that goes into these terraced fields is just within the village. So as a result, we can look at this, and we can use a multi-level evolutionary framework to understand what's likely to happen here. So if we start by thinking about the dilemma that's posed by using that forest, okay, using that shared forest. The dilemma is at the level of the village, okay? That is to say, it's between villages. Multiple villages share that forest. And so if my village decides, well, we're going to conserve that forest, it doesn't matter because the other villages haven't decided that, and we're going to lose the forest anyway. So, which is to say that when the dilemma is at the level of the village and selection is at the level of individuals, so what does that mean? That means that if it is a stronger, so if individuals are making the choice based on how it influences them, right? In this case, I can tell you very most certainly they are, then is this going to be, are we going to be conserving the forest? What is your prediction here? No. Because instead, we will be selecting for people who harvest the forest, because harvesting is good for individuals. But the problem needs to be solved at the village level. And so therefore, selection is going to favor non-cooperation in that example. However, in the example of the irrigation system, it's different, right? Here in the irrigation system, selection is at the level of the village, I would argue, which is to say that when a village does a good job organizing its irrigation system and cooperating to do the rather large amount of work it takes to maintain it and operate it, the village does well as a whole. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yep, yep, right. The dilemma is between individuals within that village, okay? Well, no, you go clean the canal. No, I'm not going to clean the canal. You clean the canal. No, I don't want to build a new diversion ditch. Well, if they can figure that out, if they can solve the social dilemma and solve the coordination problem embedded in building this irrigation system, then their village will do well, right? And so if villages are competing on some level, perhaps for economic output, perhaps for new immigrants, what have you, or perhaps other villages are imitating each other, then cooperation may spread within that village, and it may be solved, and it could actually even spread to other villages. So, so as a result, we would sort of predict that selection between villages here is going to favor cooperation in this irrigation system. And I can tell you, in that particular village, there's a lot of things that people don't cooperate on. But irrigation is one of them. Okay, another example here, and then I'd like to wrap up and show you some of the work that myself and others are doing in this, is from Bhutan, where my colleague Jeremy Brooks has studied conservation behavior. Bhutan is a really interesting example, and some of you may know of it because of its gross national happiness index. You know, it's sort of famous for people like us, right? I have friends who've been there. You can't actually go in it, but you can go to a lookout that's over here, and you get to, it's just wow. The story with Bhutan, so how did that come to be, right? So, and the story that we use to explain this is related. I'm not going to use the same graphics, but you'll be able to see the same logic. So in the last, let's say, 150 years, Bhutan has, even less than that, Bhutan has watched as its peer nations go basically extinct, right? As its peer nations, other Himalayan Buddhist kingdoms get gobbled up by India and China. You know, so Tibet and Nepal and Sikkim, you know, Nepal gets overrun and Sikkim gets taken by India and Tibet gets taken by China. And so Bhutan faces a very real existential threat from its two giant neighbors, right? So what is it going to do, right? So this is selection at the level of the nation, right? Nations are getting taken out, right? It's scared, right? What does it do? So to begin with, I'm going to rewind the clock, first of all, there's a high level of ethnic diversity in Bhutan. traditionally especially, there are four major ethnic groups, but then there are also a lot of smaller ones. And Bhutan wasn't unified until, oh goodness, I'd have to ask Jeremy. Okay, well, if someone knows the date Bhutan was unified, that would be great. But it was unified under a theocratic ruler. What we argue is that after that unification, as the peer nations started to disappear, the king of Bhutan, and it's interesting that there was a king in terms of the analysis, decided to try to save what he could of Bhutan by focusing on the cultural and environmental heritage of the country. And so there was an official kind of dress, an official language. It was Dzongkha. The environment was sort of praised and connected to the Buddhist way of life, the Eightfold Path. And so this religious and cultural identity also influenced policy at the national level and environmental policy. And interestingly, so this unification happened, I would argue, in part because of this existential threat at the level of the nation that allowed these diverse ethnic groups to come together. Now, granted, they didn't necessarily come together sort of peacefully. And, of course, there are also downsides to nationalism, including the poor treatment of ethnic Nepalis in the area. But another interesting prediction arises from this. The structure of Bhutan has recently changed. It's now no longer a kingdom, as you may know. It's a democracy. The king handed it over and said, let's make this a democracy. So it was a pretty impressive thing to do. But as a result, the country is not politically unified anymore. And so what would we predict happens then? Because it's not politically unified, we have different people expressing, different groups expressing different concepts of what the country needs to do, what the country's priorities should be, right? What the country's policies should be, and what should be prioritized. So what should be prioritized? Some say economic development. Some say cultural and religious heritage. So as a result, my understanding is that currently the gross national happiness index is going to be, if it hasn't been sort of phased out, it's going to be deprioritized. And economic development is gaining more traction, which is something that we would expect when we're thinking of cooperation within and between groups, okay? But it's not something that I personally would have seen if I hadn't been, okay? Okay, so what are the kinds of research questions we can ask with this framework? We can ask, when does cultural selection at the group level accelerate the emergence of behaviors and institutions of sustainable resource management? We can ask, when do we find evidence of this kind of pattern, right? In what sort of systems, at what sort of levels, the national level, at the municipal level? And importantly, we can also say what kind of interventions can we design? The answer for the interventions is in the paper. And there are more examples that are fun places like Fiji in the paper. Take a look at the paper. The interventions are also there, and I'm excited to have people think about them. And so I'll give you now just a sort of brief overview of some of the work that we're doing on this, and then have some time for questions. So there's a theoretical working group that I'm happy to be a part of, lead along with Karolina Safrazinska and Marco Janssen, and where we're building a bunch of different models that look at different cultural, different sort of evolutionary processes that happen in human culture and connecting them to different sort of sustainability challenges. This is everything from doing something like looking at the way social identity, whether you're green, influences product diffusion in a marketplace to looking at multi-level selection and the emergence of marine fishing quotas in fisheries, all at the sort of theoretical level. An important tool that we use in this is something called the price equation, which we use to distinguish statistically the components of evolution between individual level and group level selection. So we can ask the question when we have enough data. We can ask the question, and theoretically, of course, we always have enough data, how much selection is happening at the level of the group and how much selection is happening at the level of the individual. It's very useful. This is my agent-based model. And for those of you, I've spoken to some of you about agent-based modeling. This is really fun, and we did. We distinguish between group level selection and individual level selection. One of the things that we see with this complex simulation that I can't explain in any sort of decent way now is that when I enable the possibility for there to be groups that form on their own, group selection increases. Group selection is the force that drives the adoption of sustainable consumption. It's not individual selection. Individual selection does not drive sustainable consumption for the obvious reasons, right? It's never good for an individual to restrain themselves. They can always just take more at the cost of the group. Then we have a number of sort of empirical projects. The empirical projects now, and this is a different group led by Jeremy Brooks at Ohio State and myself. And what we do here is to try to build out research designs. We have one paper looking at sort of how we, and this is not what the paper looks like because this is sort of like a list of everything. We want all of the data in the world, and then we can test it. But how do you build realistic research designs to test some of these questions? This is a hard question, but we're making some progress with it. And we have a number of case study projects. One that I've written with an anthropologist, Sam Haynes, about blueberries in Maine, a project I'm working on with Jim Atchison about territorial lobster management. It's one of those classic cases that looks to be very ripe for multi-level selection explanation. And some related things, again, Bhutan, the diffusion of sustainable viticulture practices in the California wine industry. And another one that I'm excited about, which is reinterpreting Stephen Lansing's. For those of you who know, this is a wonderful case in Bali about the emergence of sustainable irrigation practices, and I think it may be a process of cultural group selection happening, and so we're going to be taking a look at that. We're looking at trying to develop statistical ways to test for things. This is along with Adrian Bell, a test for empirical signatures of group structure. So if you have a population of individuals that is adopting some trait, and this is your sustainability trait, and are they adopting it or not? Well, if they're just a bunch of individuals, the adoption curve might look like this. Whereas if they're adopting it in groups, the adoption curve might look different, right? And if they're adopting it in groups, that signals something. It signals that groups are important. And it might be a cooperative trait, or it might be some kind of trait that requires group-level adoption for it to really work, right? A coordinating trait. So this is a really important way to distinguish here and to find out what the role of groups are. So in my local food research, I'm two little bits here. One is, the first one is that I have an undergraduate honors student that I was so very glad to capture as a master's student. He's absolutely terrific, who did an experimental economics game, an economic experiment at a local food co-op and a grocery store in the same town. They're about a mile apart. Mostly the same people shop at both of them, although obviously there's some differences. And he just measured cooperation using a simple game, an economic experiment called the Dictator Game, and their differences. And the question is, are people cooperating more in the food co-op because there is a different organizational environment, or is it because cooperative people sort of have assorted themselves to go there? We don't know. I imagine, of course, in reality, it's a bit of both. And so but that's amazing. And these are tools and methods that we can use to measure it. Another one, particularly on the applied side, David Sloan Wilson at SUNY Binghamton has developed this web-based system, which I'll be using with some of my participating groups in the local food work. This is a tool that is used to facilitate groups learning some of the research, some of Ostrom principles about how to manage effective groups, so that they can just achieve whatever it is that they are looking to achieve. This could be religious groups, this could be local food buying clubs, this could be, you name it, sports teams, this could be, it's anything for how do we make our group work more effectively together. And so it's an outreach tool, in a sense. It's a self-help tool. So that's interesting, and we're going to be testing it. Networking is also important. We do some of that. So, in summary, culture and societies really do evolve, and that's important. And it's the main mode that we have used to adapt to the environment in the last 50,000 years. And that's a really significant thing for sustainability. But, and this is a silver lining, we come pre-adapted with capacities to make groups function. And here we have people who are making groups function right now, right? Who are making it happen. We're good at this. And in addition, another silver lining, competition between groups can be used to enhance cooperative behavior within groups. And of course, there are downsides to all of that too. And part of the downside, as we see with things like climate change, is that sometimes we're not competing with any other group. There's no other planet that we're competing with to see who has the best atmosphere, right? And if we were, then then maybe we'd all get together and say, let's beat those Martians. We can get a better atmosphere than they. We do already have a better atmosphere, and that's the problem. We feel no reason to compete. Anyway, but the point is here that it's hard, and it takes a lot of work, and that's why we're trying to sort of reach out to anyone who's interested in doing these things, and sort of build groups who see ways that they can apply some of these tools in their work, or see things that they can contribute to this, and so I am serious about this. We need your help because I'm serious about the sustainability problem, and there we go. That's it. Thank you very much. I left -1 minute for questions. Please. And then over there.
Just a curious point. So, as cultures kind of develop ways to cooperate, there seems to be a tendency to then create institutions
Yes.
around those cooperative solutions.
Sure.
Like modern government.
Yes.
But then that kind of opens an opportunity for institutional capture.
Yes.
Corruption, which is kind of a big deal in terms of the current debate in politics.
Sure.
Does your research consider that at all, between the dynamics of institutions and then also?
Right. The projects that I'm working on don't, but there is a lot of really good research and thinking about that. There's really good research in economics about corruption and how corruption works and when it's maintained. I don't think everything that's done, we're not done with that though, and more needs to be done. But you're right, it's true. And part of the problem is when we solve cooperative dilemmas and then we create institutions around them, then they're no longer cooperative dilemmas. And the interesting thing I find in the local food world is that people are excited. It feels good to cooperate, and when they do, they feel like they're part of a community, right? They gain value from that sort of directly. And then when it becomes an institution, So you build it out, right? And eventually it becomes so big you need rules, right? And you need boundaries, and you need you need role specialization, you need tasks, and you need schedules. And then it's not this sort of friendly cooperative community that we once had, right? It's something else, it's an institution, right? And you don't need cooperation for it because we have punishment. And we're going to kick you out if you don't do it. It's not a cooperative system anymore. It's a system, right? It's an institution. And so, but that's a natural process, right? That happens again and again and again all the time. We start something, we start by cooperating, and then we build an institution to solve it. The institution solves it, and now it's not that thing anymore. And so, but that whole process is part of the sort of larger part, this is how institutions evolve. Institutions emerge, and they survive, and they persist, and sometimes they die. And sometimes they die when they don't have ways to control corruption, for instance. That doesn't mean that all corrupt societies die, though. Yeah. Somebody else back here somewhere? Yeah.
How do the scales of time come into play between dissolution and forming of groups? Like in political theory, for example, you have people who will conform to the extreme left or right, and there are centrists. So if you introduce a third player that can unite the centrists, I guess arrows to these guys have proved that you will, if you take the third party away after a certain time, suddenly find that one is dominating the other. So in a larger scale of time, the group is a consequence of an individual process happening through decades.
So you want to know about the time scale of?
So I guess groups are not static in time.
That's right.
Does this model account for, I guess, how would you synergize that aspect with among the other two?
That's a good question. Perhaps you'd like to work on that? I mean, that's the answer. So I'm just trying to bring sort of some of the key insights from these literatures, the evolution of cooperation, the evolution of culture, to the sustainability world. And there are countless ways that this plugs in with lots of really good research that's already been done in economics, in political science, in geography and sociology, in all of the social sciences. Not to mention the fact that, of course, evolutionary things are very well understood in the biological and biophysical world as well. So, so most of it hasn't been done. So we need someone to do it. Yeah. Anything else? Sarah?
Well, it seems to me that the definition of, so you need to be able to define groups, and you need to be able to define an environment or a resource that they're interacting with. It seems to me
Hard.
in the modern globalized world to be hard.
Very. So
Question mark.
my colleague Adrian Bell would say, in the ideal world, if you had the data, what you would do is, now he's trying to take off, so that's him right there, would say that if in the right situations where you have the data, you allow the data to tell you what the groups are, rather than saying, well, there are these groups, I'm just going to draw these boundaries. But of course, sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes you say, well, we just have municipalities, and we're just going to say the people in the municipalities, and that's it. And then that makes perfectly good sense in a lot of cases. Yeah, but I agree, it gets really messy. And there are groups that overlaps groups.
With its own irrigation system is a neatly defined system.
Yes,
right?
but in fact, this is just the one that happens to be like that. All of the rest of the villages in this region are like complicated sharing of systems and streams, and yeah, right. And so we don't have a simple way to deal with that. And of course, the groups that matter change over time, right? So maybe villages, sort of fade away, and irrigation, networks become the thing that really matters, and where even marital disputes get solved in the future. And so you don't know when a certain sort of institutional structure is going to fade away. And so I don't have any sort of sense about how to know how to do that. But so we're starting at the basic level of just sort of saying, well, if we can identify groups, and particularly if we can identify groups of groups, right? Then we have 2 or 3 levels. Then we can think, okay, is this a social dilemma? What is the sustainability trait that's of interest? And where is the strongest level of selection? Where does the rubber really meet the road? Are individuals making the decision in order to survive, or in order to, put their kids in the right school, or in order to get the job they want, or are groups making the decision? And that's, yeah.
I'm just having trouble understanding how the understanding from biology transfers to these social problems. Just to give you some background, I'm an engineer raised by a biologist, so
Oh, cool.
I think of biology as being a deterministic, because I have a very simplified understanding of genetics. But you mentioned the issue on the variation side, so we know that it's random and versus non-random in social situations, but it seems to me that the inheritance would be the bigger issue, because inheritance in a biological situation is completely non-optional, and we have
That's right.
no choice over it.
That's
until
right.
We already know the outcome until that individual has at least lived to reproductive age.
Right.
Whereas in social systems, it's completely optional, and we do get the advantage of being able to look and see if that worked for that group or that individual.
Before we adopt it, right?
You could argue that we're getting to a point where humans can select for traits as
Oh,
we
yeah.
reproduce. So your work may inform biology more than biology informs you, but I'm just wondering what hurdles you run into, because it seems like a completely different process to me if your inheritance is something that you actually have decision control.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, it is a completely different process. It's still Darwinian in that there is still variation. The variation is still transmitted within the population between individuals, right? Albeit by a different route, and that variation matters, right? And selection occurs. So Darwinian in that sense, right? That's all Darwin said is variation, selection, inheritance. Check. There's a lot of other things that matter, right? And so the strategic imitation is a huge deal. The fact that we can imitate successful people only is a huge deal. So is it different? Yes. It makes it way faster, for instance. Yeah, it's a very different process, like you say. But just on that, we of course, genetic evolution and cultural evolution, or genes and culture, of course, co-evolve too, right? And so we're at the stage now where it's likely that if it hasn't happened already, and in some lab that we don't know about, perhaps in China or elsewhere, it will happen in the next 10 or 20 years, that we're going to be having genetically modified humans. We already have genetically modified plants. What is genetic modification? It's when you take a gene from here and you put it in this plant over there. Well, what is that? How do you do that thing where you go, here we go. What is that? It's this, right? So it's taking what used to be a biological system, which is to say the environment, right? And it's making it a cultural system. So we have, potatoes with fish genes in them, or is that what it is? No, it's tomatoes with fish genes, right? So they don't freeze. So that's now a cultural product. It has evolved culturally, right? So yeah, it's very different.
Join me in thanking Tim for a fascinating lecture.